we're going to move on to the last portion of our evening, which is we get to hear from an esteemed author, David Grann. And what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about why we're honoring David Grann. So, the Founders Inspiring Writers Award has been given to a variety of writers, from Viet Thanh Nguyen and Henry Louis Gates to Susan Orlean. But tonight we are thrilled to present the award to a writer whose work grabs readers with amazing suspense and fascinating characters, all drawn from remarkably true but often hidden stories. The remarkable writer, David Grann. From the lost city of Z to his newest book, The Wager, Grann's nonfiction books and articles are such rich and engaging narratives that filmmakers, including the likes of Martin Scorsese, continue to look to them as a source of inspiring stories that they want to bring to life on the screen. David has described his writing and the intense research behind it as a form of excavation. He is digging into the past to show us the rich, important stories that have been buried. But once revealed, they are powerful tools to better understand not just the past, but its reflection on who we are today. The American Writers Museum is thrilled to present the Founders Inspiring Writer Award this year to David Grann. So please give a great round of applause to David Grann and Peter Sagal, who are going to come up and have a little talk.
Hello again. I just want to say the Founders Award, of course, is named for our founder, Malcolm O'Hagan. And my understanding is that they went to him and they said, you know, we're going to be giving this award to prestigious writers and it's going to be a big deal and we'd like to name it after you. And he refused and said, no, 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 don't use my name, just call it the Founders Award. Malcolm. Come on. How cool would it be to have the O'Hagan Award? Did you hear about David Grann? He won an O'Hagan. We could have another O. People would brag about wanting to win the EGOT. I'm just urging you, Malcolm. Think about it. David, hello.
Hello, Peter.
It's so good to see you again. David and I had a chance to meet and talk a little bit at another event in the spring. And this is actually a true story. I realized that I did not have a copy of his first enormous bestseller, The Lost City of Z. I just read the magazine article, and I happened to be up in the Andersonville neighborhood at a family thing, and I had a few minutes to pick up a book. So I called the local bookstore. They said, oh, we don't have it. Can we order it? And I said, no, I need it today. So there was a used bookstore also nearby. Heritage, I think it's called Heritage Books, and I called them up. And the guy's like, hello? And I said, hi, I'm calling to see if you have a particular book. Well, what book? It's called The Lost City of Z by David Grann. He says, what is it? I said, well, it's nonfiction. And he said, what kind of nonfiction? And I was stuck. And I didn't know what to say. So what should I have said? What kind of nonfiction are you writing?
Oh, my gosh. First of all, just thank you all so much for this.
You did have it, by the way.
Thank you so much for this award. And I think part of the award said inspiring author, but I have to say that much of what we do is kind of very isolated, spend a lot of time in archives, and being at an event like this is just extraordinarily inspiring and an inspiration. So I feel like it should be in reverse. What kind of writer am I? Well, I think in the introduction they said excavator, and that's probably a good word in a way. Early in my career, I tried fiction, but unlike Brett, I can't do it. I'm not very good at it. My imagination is kind of paltry. And at a certain point, I started to realize that if I eavesdropped on enough conversations or dug into enough archives, if, as Sherlock Holmes said, you could kind of lift the roofs off and peer inside the houses, you would find so many fascinating stories. They would be stranger than fiction. And so to some extent, that is kind of what I do. I try to find real stories to get as close to the consciousness of real people through excavation. And each of the stories are very, very different. Lost City Z is about Larry David getting lost in the Amazon, which is my spirit animal, Larry David. Killers of the Flower Moon is about murderous crime and racial injustice in the early 20th century in Oklahoma against members of the Osage Nation. And The Wager is about seamen from the 18th century who get stranded on a desolate island and slowly descend into a real-life Lord of the Flies. But I do think there is a thematic connection, which I'm only kind of slowly realizing, which is they are all, in many ways, investigations of the truth, the way we tell our stories, the way we edit them, the way we leave out certain parts, and not just the way people tell their own stories, but also how nations and empires tell their stories.
It was actually kind of interesting. Once they found me the book, I opened it up, and I found something that I had not come across before, which is a moment where you describe a common thread between your works. And since you wrote it, you should read it. It's in bold. It's in bold right there.
Oh, okay. While most of my articles seem unrelated, they typically have one common thread: obsession. They're about ordinary people driven to do extraordinary things, things that most of us would never dare, who get some germ of an idea in their heads that metastasizes until it consumes them. That's a lot better than what I said, actually.
I know. Whoever came up with that has some talent. Look, I want to get back into the connecting threads of your work. You said something interesting a moment ago about stories that people tell and stories that are not true that people tell. But I want to get back to your origin story. I found out recently that you come from a literary family.
Yes.
That your mother was the very first woman to be a CEO of a major publisher.
Yes. Yep.
And so were you raised with literary expectations?
I was. Well, I wouldn't say I was raised with literary expectations, but a little bit like I've got to visit the wonderful museum today and seeing all these incredible authors. And I was blessed as a child to, hang out with Judy Blume and other these writers who, of course, her books were often on the very high shelf that you weren't supposed to read. And of course, those were the only ones we did want to read. And so they were kind of my heroes. I mean, they were the people I just thought they were really cool and interesting. But I will say that my mother only gave me one piece of advice when I was young. She said, whatever you do, don't become a writer. And I think she was afraid of, that it can be a hard life. And so like any good son, I devoted about 20 years of failure to prove her wrong.
Do you remember, since we've been talking with and hearing from both writers and their teachers or inspirations, do you have anybody in particular? Was it a writer you were reading? Was it somebody who you met, a teacher, anybody else who inspired you and actually set you in the course?
I'm just thinking about it. For me, writers, and so many different writers, were the way I always kind of made sense of the world. For me, the world is always kind of fractured. It's always a little blurred. I'm actually semi-blind, and but the way I see the world often feels very fractured. And growing up, the world felt very fractured. And so both the act of writing and forcing yourself to think and try to piece things together. Some of the early writers I wrote were actually a lot of detective writers like Sherlock Holmes. But I would say there was one teacher I had, Margot Livesey, who's a wonderful novelist, who helped me to just look at the world. I always thought that somehow the way I looked at the world, slightly crooked, there was something kind of wrong with that. That, I was trying to always straighten out the world. And she told me that it's okay, that the world can be a little cracked, it can be a little fractured, and it's okay to see it that way. So she was one of the more inspiring teachers I have had.
Do you remember the first thing you wrote that you got paid for?
Yeah. So I was living in Mexico after I graduated from college. I had a research fellowship there, and I decided I wanted to try to do some freelance journalism. And so I would write articles, and in those days there were no faxes, there was no email. So I would type up my article on a little typewriter like I saw today at the museum, and type it up, cross it out, then you have to retype it up. And then there was no way to send it. So I would get on a bus. I would drive 2 hours to Mexico City because I lived outside Mexico City. I would bring my little copy very nervously to an editor. It was La Jornada. It was a newspaper, but they had an English magazine. And the editor would sit there, and I would sit there very nervously, and they would read my copy. And if they liked it, they gave me $1, which was just enough for the bus ride back. And I had about a 50% dollar rate, meaning 50% went down, and I lost money on the bus. But those were the first pieces I ever got paid for being published.
What were you writing about?
I would just, any kind of local thing, some of the local politics I was happy. I lived in Puebla, Mexico, sometimes cultural stories. Sometimes there might be small little vignettes about the families I was living with and doing research with.
Do you remember a moment in your writing life where you came across a story, whatever it might have been, and you said, yeah, this is it. This is what I'm supposed to be doing, is this kind of story?
That's so interesting. Well, I will say the first stories I ever heard were stories that my grandmother told me. And I think more than the writers I talked about earlier on that were around me, the thing that really inspired me to want to be a writer was my grandmother. My grandparents were immigrants. And my grandfather at that time was in his 70s, but he had a stroke, and he really couldn't move. And he would sit on our porch, and he was a fairly, he was an elderly man, and again, he really couldn't talk, and he couldn't move much, so I never really knew him. And she would tell me these, I would sit there looking at him out the window, and she would tell me these stories about how he had fled Russia on foot during the revolution, how he had gone down the Khyber Pass in a motorcycle and his brakes had failed. And I just kept looking at this person, and she was bringing them alive to me. And suddenly I could see this person moving and talking and crashing. And it was just, to me, it opened up a person. I could suddenly know somebody I didn't think I could know. And I think for me, that was probably the most inspiring thing for me as a writer, or wanting to be a writer.
One of the things I found out is that you were also a true crime writer, which of course is not surprising given Killers of the Flower Moon, and a sports writer. And it occurs to me, you could have made a killing as a podcaster. Got into the wrong line of work. Your books have become enormously successful. And I wonder if that's ever a bit of a burden, in the sense that, what's David Grann's next book gonna be? Oh my God, I love Killers of the Flower, Lost City of Z, amazing. Killers of the Flower Moon, did you see the movie? Wow, what's the next one going to be?
Well, let me tell you, if you have teenage children, you can never get to, they will always bring you down to earth very quickly.
This is true.
Most of my books take about a half a decade of research and writing. And you kind of just get lost in that world. The thing you think about is less what other people's expectations are, but are you going to do justice to the material? And that is a burden. I mean, you live with that sense of, to me, writing is about failure. Every project I write, I mean, I don't want to be disparaging on at an event like this, but is a failure in the sense that I have some ideal that I'm trying to reach, and I will never get there. I get as close to it as I can, and then you start over again, and you pursue it. But it's that burden, like when I was working on Killers of the Flower Moon, especially with a subject like that, you felt, I had collected photographs of many of the Osage family members who had been killed during these crimes. And early on, I had just had a few photographs, and as I discovered there were more and more people who had been murdered, I gathered more photographs, and they were in my little office on the shelves. And every time I went into that office, those were the voices and the faces that I looked at. They were a reminder of what I was doing. But that, for me, is the much larger burden, but also why you do what you want to do. It is a reminder what this is about. It's not about you. It's why you call it a Founders Award. It's why it's about these people's stories, about doing justice to their stories, about hopefully, for a little kid who always saw the world as kind of fractured, at least giving it a little bit more meaning and making sense of it.
Have you ever, You've mentioned detectives a couple times. I know one of your acclaimed early articles was about these Sherlock Holmes aficionados who ended up dead. And one of the things that occurred to me, in fact, it occurred to me just for the first time, that the one potential link in your books is you're sort of piercing through, for lack of a less polite term, layers of bullshit.
Yeah, 100%.
You're trying to find out what happened.
Yeah, and you and somebody here today talked about the facade there, and you asked me about one story, and a lot of it is piercing BS. And there was a moment that for me really did change my career, because you don't just become, I did all sorts of different things. I was a teacher. I have so much admiration for teachers. The hardest job I ever had, I did it for 1 year. I had a full head of hair and I came out looking like him.
Wait a minute. Why did you need to gesture to me at that moment? It would have been just as easy for you to say, I came out looking like this.
So in any case, it was a very meandering path to this. Okay. So, but I was doing a story about a congressperson, a man named James Traficant, from Youngstown, Ohio. I heard he was being investigated for corruption, and I had only known him in when I covered Congress in an early job covering Capitol Hill as the honorable gentleman from Ohio. But I heard he was being investigated by the feds, and so I went out to Youngstown, and I had heard that he had been investigated many, many years earlier, like 2 decades earlier when he was running for sheriff, and that he had taken money from the mob. And I found a transcript of an old recording, and I think they were brothers. I think if it's been a long time, I think it was Lenny the Crab and Orly the Crab. One of the Crab brothers had been completely rubbed out. He was the one who had made the recording. He was gone. Like, when I mean rubbed out, he was dead. He was never seen again. And in this recording, it is with the honorable gentleman, or who would become the honorable gentleman from Ohio. And he's running for sheriff. He's talking about taking bribes from both sides of the mobs. He's talking about people coming swimming up in the Mahoning River. He's dropping the F-bomb every other word. And I thought, okay, well, this is piercing some BS. And I suddenly was like, that is the real story. That is the voice. And it was the first time I really discovered the power of archives, that you can find materials, you can find recordings, you can find things that peel away the facade and get you closer to the truth.
I only have 2 more questions, which is, first of all, what's next? Can you tell us?
So,
if you can't tell us what it is, can you tell us at least, have you decided?
Yes. So in fact, I'm in a dark hole right now. And so if I'm inarticulate, please forgive me. I've been staring at a computer for many days in a row. I am working on a new book, which I'm a little cryptic about, because partly because of its subject matter. It's about espionage. Unlike my previous 2 big books, people are still alive, and they're kind of meet with me in these kind of dark, well, I don't want to say alleyways, but everybody is...
Traditionally, it's a parking garage.
Yeah, parking garage, yeah. So they're moving the flower pot. So people are a little squirrely. But in many ways, and it's about spies, and it takes place in the Cold War, but it is the connection for me. Each one of my previous 2 books have kind of led to the next book. So Killers of the Flower Moon, I was so haunted by why certain stories get told and some others don't. Why do certain stories become part of our national consciousness, and why do others get erased? And that led me, oddly enough, to The Wager, which could not be different, but in many ways is a story about how history gets erased and how the empire decides to tell a very mythical tale. And so even though the subject matter, the people are very different, there was a connective tissue. And the world I am right now is in many ways the world in which we all live, which is a world of complete misinformation, complete disinformation, complete propaganda. And how do you find out the truth? How do you kind of fit the pieces together? So it takes place in the past, but without me hopefully saying it, it is a bit of a metaphor for our own time period.
And that actually leads me to my last question, which is, as far as I know, Killers of the Flower Moon has not been banned anywhere. Am I right?
Semi.
Semi, okay.
Semi-right. In Oklahoma, they had passed a law that something to the effect of certain matters couldn't be taught if they caused discomfort. So we're all in the word business. What does that mean? Like, how do you know what causes discomfort? And isn't discomfort part of how we learn and think? And so there were certain teachers in Oklahoma that had the book and were afraid to teach it for afraid of losing their license. So the law was kind of written in this murky way that it led to what a former Osage chief referred to me, and I thought it was the right word, as this kind of soft censorship.
And so you're somebody who is, as we discussed a moment ago, is a professional piercer of bullshit, which sometimes takes a tremendous amount of effort and spelunking to get through the layers of bullshit that have been layered. And I just wanted to bring it back to the thing that I started the evening with, which is the moment we're in. Do you feel that you as a careful and successful writer of nonfiction have a role to play in the current moment? Or is that just too much to put on the sadly exposed head of a mere honest, ink-stained wretch such as yourself?
Had I known we were coming here, I would have gotten some of those hair plugs and done something. Yeah, you know, it's interesting. So when I was even working on The Wager, for example, I felt like we were living in these very complicated times, and I didn't quite know how to write about the current moment because we're living in my new refrain to myself is, may you write about interesting times, but may you please live in boring ones. And unfortunately, we are living deep inside of history right now, and it's very hard to know how it will unfold. I think we all have responsibilities. Figuring out what that responsibility is as citizens, as writers, or whatever we do, I think to our communities and to the world we're going to leave to our children. And I will say I have kind of two sides to me about this. One side is often very dispirited because you write because you believe that these stories matter in some ways and that the truth matters. And increasingly, it occurs to me that often we don't really want the truth. We prefer the stories that please us, or the half facts, or the quarter facts, the things that play to our emotions. We want to stay in our own little silos, in our own little bubbles. We don't want to have difficult conversations. And that's the part that I sometimes find dispiriting because it does undercut the very thing that I believe in. On the other hand, and it comes back to what I started with, when I'm at an event like this tonight, I feel great optimism. When I saw Britt present that award to the teacher, when I saw those young students and their beautiful writing and the meaning and how words matter, when I go to the museum today and I got to play on a recording Faulkner reading in his voice as I lay dying, I mean, I was just blown away and rattled, and I realized, you know what? Stories and words still do matter.
Ladies and gentlemen, David Grann, the winner of this year's Founders Award for Inspiring Writer. David, thank you so much. What a pleasure. David Grann, everybody.